In the heart of a billion-dollar research facility, CEO Victoria Hammond snapped, "Stay out of my lab," as Janitor Marcus Reed tucked away a grease-smudged sketchbook of circuit fail-safes. Hours later, a Phoenix micro-reactor screamed past redline, glass trembling. Engineers frozen by cascading alarms. Victoria, trapped behind a locked blast door, fought a manual valve that wouldn't turn. Marcus vaulted security rails and disappeared into the service crawl, wiring a dead bypass by hand, the move that would expose who he really was. The morning sun cut through Hammond Technologies' glass atrium, like a blade of pure possibility. Victoria Hammond's heels clicked against polished marble as she passed rows of monitors displaying real-time performance metrics. Each screen a testament to the empire her father had started and she had transformed. At 34, she commanded the kind of presence that made board members straighten their ties and engineers double-check their calculations. Headlines scrolled across the lobby's newsfeed. Hammond Technologies promises clean energy revolution, and Phoenix Core set to transform power generation. Stephen Parker, the company's chief technology officer, fell into step beside her, tablet in hand. 10 days until the investor demonstration, he reported, his voice carrying the weight of a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks. "We're pushing 92% efficiency on controlled runs." Victoria's jaw tightened imperceptibly. 92 wasn't 100. In her world, close enough meant someone else would get there first. "Push it harder," she ordered, her voice carrying the same cold precision that had tripled the company's valuation in 3 years. "Schedule extended runtime tests through the weekend." Stephen hesitated, a flicker of concern crossing his features before professional instinct smoothed it away. They both knew what pushing meant, cutting corners on protocols that existed for reasons written in scorch marks and settlement checks. That night, while the executive floors emptied and the building's heartbeat slowed to its nighttime rhythm, Marcus Reed pushed his maintenance cart through the technical corridors. At 36, he moved with the deliberate calm of someone who had learned to make himself invisible. His uniform bore no name tag, just a simple designation: night maintenance. He replaced flickering lights with methodical precision, each movement economical and practiced. But when he reached the auxiliary pressure gauge outside Lab 7, his hands stilled. The needle trembled in a pattern that shouldn't exist, 2-bar oscillations every 30 seconds. Marcus pulled a worn handkerchief from his pocket, revealing a small notebook beneath. His pencil moved across the page in quick, precise strokes, capturing the anomaly in notation that would make most engineers pause. Pressure variance, irregular cycling, potential valve degradation. The observations filled the margin next to a detailed sketch of bypass circuits and relief manifold configurations. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Ryan Mitchell, head of security, rounded the corner with 2 guards. "Reed," he called out, his tone carrying the weight of authority. "You're scheduled for the East Wing tonight." Marcus tucked the notebook away, but not before Ryan caught the gesture. Rules were rules, and Ryan lived by them like scripture. Maintain proper boundaries. Technical areas are off limits without supervision. The blast door to Lab 7 hissed open and Victoria emerged, her expression sharp enough to cut glass. She took in the scene her security chief, the janitor, the proximity to her most sensitive project. Her eyes locked onto Marcus, and something in his stillness, his refusal to shrink under her gaze, sparked irritation. "Stay out of my lab," she commanded, each word dropping like ice into water. The order hung in the air as she strode past, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive perfume and absolute authority. Marcus watched her go, his hand unconsciously touching the notebook in his pocket. On its pages, between maintenance schedules and supply lists, lived another world-detailed schematics of safety systems, redundancy protocols, and most importantly, a bypass design that could save lives when primary systems failed. The amber warning light on the pressure gauge flickered behind him, a harbinger dressed as a glitch. 2 floors below in the main control room, Jessica Chen studied readouts that made her stomach tighten. The 2-year-old safety engineer had joined Hammond Technologies, with ideals about changing the world through responsible innovation. 3 years later, she found herself fighting battles in meeting rooms where profit projections spoke louder than pressure readings. Valve 3 amperes is showing early signs of stick-slip behavior, she reported to Stephen during the late-night system check. We should run a full diagnostic before the demo. Stephen's fingers drummed against his tablet, calculating lost time against gained reputation. We don't have the schedule flexibility, he decided, his practical nature winning over caution. Log it for post-demonstration maintenance. Jessica bit back her response, knowing it would fall on deaf ears. The culture at Hammond Technologies had shifted from move fast and break things to move faster and hope nothing breaks. She made her own notation in the system log, her small act of rebellion. Valve 3 amperes showing sticky behavior. Diagnostic, strongly recommended. In the technical waste room, Marcus salvaged discarded circuit boards from the recycling bins. Other janitors might see garbage. He saw puzzles waiting to be solved. A damaged power regulation board caught his attention, its failure point obvious to his trained eye. He pulled a small multimeter from his cart, a tool no janitor should need, and began testing connections. Within minutes, he had identified how to bridge the damaged section, creating a makeshift power backup using nothing more than copper wire and borrowed components. His notebook gained another page of observations, another solution to a problem that might never be acknowledged. The executive conference room hummed with tension the next morning. Margaret Stone, chair of the board, commanded the head of the table, like a general surveying a battlefield. At 55, she had overseen 3 major acquisitions and had no patience for anything that might compromise the upcoming IPO. We're 48 hours behind the Asian markets, she stated, her words cutting through Stephen's technical update. Every day we delay is a day our competitors gain ground. Victoria weighed her options with the calculating precision of a chess grandmaster. The responsible choice was to maintain the full testing protocol. The profitable choice was to accelerate. We'll streamline the secondary safety validations, she announced, signing the approval that would eliminate a crucial redundancy test. Non-critical systems only. The decision rippled through the room, relief and concern mixing in unequal measures. Robert Lancaster, their largest investor, smiled from the video screen, his satisfaction evident. Push it to 110% for the demonstration, he urged. We need to make a statement. Night fell again over Hammond Technologies, and with it came the quiet desperation of deadlines approaching too fast. Victoria stood in her glass office, staring at a framed photograph of David Hammond. Her father's eyes seemed to follow her, carrying the weight of legacy and loss. On her desk, an unfinished letter in his handwriting lay preserved under glass. The discrepancy in the final blueprints must verify before the words ended there, cut short by the explosion that had claimed 3 lives 15 years ago, destroying the first Phoenix prototype and nearly ending the company. The world believed David Hammond's ambition had caused that tragedy. Victoria had built her entire career on proving that his vision, if not his methods, had been correct. She picked up her tablet, scrolling through the current Phoenix specifications. Every safety measure, every redundancy, every protocol existed because of lessons learned in blood and lawsuits. Yet here she was, systematically overriding them for the sake of a demonstration that would make or break everything she'd worked toward. 20 miles away, in a modest apartment that smelled of instant noodles and machine oil, Marcus Reed sat at a small kitchen table with his daughter, Emma, 8 years old, with her mother's eyes and her father's quiet intensity, carefully assembled a miniature robot from a kit he'd modified to be more challenging. "Did you used to work in a real laboratory?" she asked, her innocent question hanging in the air like an accusation. Marcus's hand paused over the instruction manual he'd rewritten to include advanced concepts. "Sometimes people work in different places," he said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of choices made and unmade. "What matters is doing good work wherever you are." On the wall behind them, barely visible in the dim light, hung a photograph of a younger Marcus with a woman whose smile could light up rooms. Rachel Reed, brilliant biochemist, victim of the first Phoenix incident. The photograph was the only evidence in the apartment of a life before janitor's uniforms and midnight shifts. Emma held up her completed robot, its LED eyes blinking in a pattern she'd programmed herself. "Mom would have loved this," she said matter-of-factly, the way children do when death is a fact rather than a fresh wound. Marcus pulled her close, inhaling the scent of her strawberry shampoo, grounding himself in the present. "She would have," he agreed, his mind drifting to the notebook hidden in his work locker, filled with safety designs that might have saved her if they'd existed 15 years ago. Back at Hammond Technologies, the night shift had reached the critical testing phase. The Phoenix micro-reactor hummed in its containment chamber, its song climbing toward the 92% threshold. Engineers monitored readouts with the intense focus of surgeons in an operating room. Jessica watched the pressure readings climb, her trained eye catching patterns that the automated systems classified as acceptable variants. The sawtooth progression wasn't smooth, it stuttered and surged like a heart-developing arrhythmia. "We should abort," she said to the night supervisor, her voice cutting through the mechanical ambiance. "These pressure spikes aren't random." The supervisor, a company man who'd learned to value his mortgage over his misgivings, shook his head. "Stephen cleared us for 95%. We're only at 92. Jessica's fingers flew across her keyboard, documenting every anomaly, every deviation, every ignored warning. If something went wrong, she'd have proof that someone had seen it coming. Victoria arrived at the facility at 2:00 the morning, unable to sleep with the demonstration looming. She badged into Lab 7, her CEO override granting access to every door, except one ironic. Since the system was designed to protect executives from exactly the situation about to unfold, she wanted to see the Phoenix herself, to stand before the culmination of her father's dream and her own ambition. The blast door sealed behind her with a soft hiss, the magnetic locks engaging with finality. Inside the observation chamber, she was as close to the reactor as safety protocols allowed, separated only by reinforced glass and confidence in systems she'd just ordered streamlined. The pressure gauges caught her attention first. The readings were within acceptable ranges. But the pattern was wrong. She'd spent enough time in these labs to know the difference between the steady breathing of a stable reaction and the ragged gasps of a system under stress. She reached for the intercom to call the control room. But the light remained dark. The communication system was offline, a non-critical system that hadn't made the priority list for maintenance. In the maintenance corridor, Marcus heard at first a high-pitched whistle beneath the usual mechanical sounds. The hiss of pressure seeking escape through paths not designed for it. He abandoned his cart, moving toward the sound, with a purpose that had nothing to do with cleaning floors. His notebook was already in his hand. Pages, flipping to the bypass designs he'd refined over countless night shifts. The service hatch to the mechanical sublevel beckoned, a route no executive would know existed. The control room erupted in cascading alarms. Screens flashed from amber to red as the Phoenix core touched 96% capacity and kept climbing. "Pressure runaway in progress," Jessica announced, her fingers flying across emergency protocols. "Valve 3 amperes is stuck closed. The relief system can't compensate." Stephen appeared on her screen within seconds, his home office backdrop incongruous with the crisis. "Can you remote override?" His question carried the desperation of a man watching his career evaporate. "Negative," Jessica replied, pulling up system schematics. "The solenoid is dead. No power to the backup circuit either." On her screen, the reactor's temperature climbed toward critical thresholds. The blast doors had automatically sealed standard protocol for a containment event, the same protocol that had just turned the observation chamber into a potential tomb. Victoria fought the manual override wheel with every ounce of strength her executive gym membership had built. The valve was designed for emergency operation, but the mounting pressure had turned it into an immovable monument to physics. Her designer gloves, never meant for manual labor, began to smoke from the friction. Sweat ran down her back, her breathing shallow in the increasingly hot air. Through the reinforced glass, she could see the Phoenix core glowing brighter, its light shifting from industrial blue to angry white. The service crawl space barely accommodated Marcus's shoulders as he navigated by memory and emergency lighting. Ahead, the auxiliary power bus lay exposed, a casualty of cost-cutting retrofits that had removed redundant shielding. The bus was dead, its connection to the emergency systems severed by modifications that prioritized efficiency over reliability. But Marcus had seen this before, studied it, solved it in the margins of his notebook during countless quiet hours. He pulled materials from his pockets like a magician, preparing for the most important trick of his life. Copper wire salvaged from discarded equipment, a voltage regulator pulled from a broken floor buffer, alligator clips that had no business in a janitor's toolkit. His hands moved with the precision of someone who'd once designed systems like this before tragedy had taught him that being right wasn't the same as being able to save someone. Not again. He whispered to the darkness, the words carrying 15 years of guilt and grief. His fingers found purchase on the exposed contacts. Ignoring the bite of electricity that jumped through inadequate insulation, he could hear Rachel's voice in his memory, teasing him about his tendency to over-engineer safety systems. "You can't save everyone from everything," she'd said. He hadn't been able to save her, but maybe, just maybe, he could save someone else's Rachel. Ryan Mitchell stood at the security checkpoint, watching the chaos unfold on multiple screens. His security protocols were clear. During a containment event, no one entered the restricted zone. But there was Marcus Reed, the janitor who wasn't supposed to know the difference between a circuit breaker and a particle accelerator, navigating the mechanical systems like he'd designed them. Ryan's hand hovered over the override that would flood the crawl space with suppression foam, following protocol that prioritized containment over individual lives. "Give him 30 seconds, Jessica said from behind him, her voice cutting through his hesitation. "Look at what he's doing." On the thermal imaging screen, they could see Marcus creating connections that shouldn't exist, building a bridge between dead systems using garbage and genius. Ryan's hand pulled back. Sometimes, he realized, the rules needed to break before people did. The solenoid clicked. It was a small sound, barely audible over the alarms and chaos. But to Jessica, it was symphony. "I've got response on valve 3 amperes, she announced, her fingers flying across the controls. Someone's restored partial power to the bypass circuit. Stephen's face on the screen cycled through confusion, disbelief, and something approaching hope. "How is that possible?" "The entire bus is offline. Someone's doing it manually," Jessica replied, watching the power readings fluctuate with the rhythm of human intervention rather than mechanical precision. "They're physically bridging the circuits." The idea was insane, dangerous, and absolutely brilliant. It was the kind of solution that only someone who understood the systems at a fundamental level could execute. And only someone desperate enough would try. Victoria felt the valve shudder beneath her burning hands. The immovable object had found its irresistible force, and physics was negotiating the terms of surrender. She threw her entire weight against the wheel, her father's words echoing in her memory. Engineering is about understanding not just how things work, but how they fail. The valve turned first in millimeters, then inches. Each movement a small victory against catastrophe. The Phoenix core's scream changed pitch, the sound of pressure finding release through properly designed channels rather than seeking its own violent path. The temperature readings peaked and held, then began their slow descent toward stability. The blast door's magnetic locks disengaged with a definitive thunk, the system recognizing the transition from crisis to recovery. Victoria stumbled out, her legs barely supporting her, to find Marcus emerging from the service hatch, his uniform singed, his hands bleeding from electrical burns, his notebook fallen open on the ground. The pages revealed themselves in the harsh emergency lighting, detailed schematics of the exact bypass he'd just implemented by hand, margin notes in precise handwriting describing failure modes and solutions, and in the corner of one page, a small notation. Reed-Bypass Protocol, for when the primary systems forget their purpose. The design was elegant, intuitive, and hauntingly familiar. Victoria had seen similar notation before in her father's unfinished letter, in the archives of the original Phoenix project. "Reed," she said, the name carrying new weight as understanding dawned. "Marcus Reed, you were on the original design team. It wasn't a question." The evidence was written in every line of his improvised salvation, in the confidence with which he'd navigated systems that had been modified beyond recognition, in the guilt that had driven him to spend 5 years as a janitor in the building where his wife had died. Marcus collapsed against the wall, exhaustion finally claiming its due. His notebook lay between them, a bridge between past and present, between the engineer he'd been and the janitor he'd become. "Someone had to remember," he said quietly, his words barely audible over the dying alarms. "Someone had to be here when it happened again." And then, darkness claimed him, his body finally admitting what his will had denied. He'd given everything to prevent history from repeating. The hospital corridor smelled of disinfectant and worry. Victoria sat in an uncomfortable chair outside Marcus's room, her designer suit replaced with borrowed scrubs, her hands wrapped in gauze that made holding coffee impossible. Emma Reed sat beside her, clutching a half-assembled robot, her young face carrying the weight of almost losing the only parent she had left. They didn't speak what was there to say between a CEO who'd nearly died and a child who'd nearly been orphaned by the same company that had already taken her mother. Catherine Brooks arrived at 3:00 the morning, her arrival announced by the click of practical heels and the rustle of old paper. The internal auditor had the look of someone who'd found something significant in the archives, something that changed everything. "You need to see this," she said, spreading documents across the waiting room's coffee table with the reverence usually reserved for historical artifacts. The papers told a story 15 years in the making. David Hammond's original designs, annotated with safety protocols that would have prevented the first disaster. But the final implementation drawings showed modifications, subtle changes in materials and tolerances that had transformed precision engineering into a time bomb. The modifications hadn't been signed by David. They bore the stamp of a third-party optimization firm brought in by early investors to reduce costs. "Your father tried to stop it," Catherine explained, her voice gentle but firm. "These are his protests, filed 2 days before the accident. He knew something was wrong, but the board overruled him." Victoria stared at the papers, each one a vindication she'd never thought possible. Her father hadn't caused the disaster he'd tried to prevent it, just as Marcus had prevented its sequel. More documents emerged, these bearing the name Reed in the margins. Design proposals for safety systems, redundancy protocols, bypass mechanisms, all submitted by a young engineer named Marcus Reed in the weeks before the first incident. Each one had been marked under review or pending cost analysis. None had been implemented in time to save his wife or protect his mentor's reputation. He blamed himself, Victoria said, understanding flooding through her like dawn breaking. He thought if he'd pushed harder, been more insistent. She looked toward Marcus's room, where machines monitored the rhythms of a man who'd carried 15 years of guilt for a disaster he'd tried to prevent. So he came back as a janitor to be here when it happened again. Emma looked up from her robot, her young voice cutting through the adult complexities. "Dad always said, the most important work happens when no one's watching," she offered, her words carrying wisdom beyond her years. Maybe that's why he became a janitor, so he could watch without anyone watching him. The truth was elegant in its tragedy. 2 men, mentor and student, had tried to build something revolutionary and safe. The system had failed them, chosen profit over prudence, and the cost had been measured in lives. One man had died with his reputation in ruins. The other had lived with his guilt in shadows, and both had left behind children, biological and intellectual, to clean up the mess. The morning brought lawyers and executives, reporters and investigators. Stephen arrived with a tablet full of technical analysis, his practical nature warring with newfound humility. "The Reed bypass," he said, showing Victoria the data. "It's brilliant. We could have implemented this years ago for less than $1 million. It would have prevented 30% of our near-miss incidents. Then we implement it now, Victoria ordered, her voice carrying new authority born from near-death clarity. Full safety review, everything. I don't care what it costs or how long it delays us. Stephen nodded, relief evident in his features. He'd been waiting for someone to say those words for 3 years. The board meeting was a massacre of priorities. Margaret Stone argued for containment, for spinning the story to minimize damage to the stock price. Robert Lancaster demanded they stay on schedule, suggesting they could implement fixes after the IPO. Others proposed settlements, silence the corporate machinery of making problems disappear into legal footnotes. Victoria stood at the head of the table, her bandaged hands flat against the polished wood. No, she said, the word carrying the weight of transformation. We tell the truth. All of it. The original disaster, the current near miss, and every decision that led to both. The room erupted in protests, predictions of bankruptcy, warnings of lawsuits that would destroy everything they'd built. My father's reputation died for something he didn't do, Victoria continued, her voice cutting through the chaos. Marcus Reed's wife died for something that could have been prevented. I nearly died for a demo that would have been forgotten in a week. The lies stop now. She turned to the door, pausing at the threshold. Anyone who disagrees is welcome to sell their shares. I'll buy them myself, if necessary. The press conference was brief and brutal. Victoria stood before the cameras, flanked by Jessica and a still recovering Marcus, and told the truth. She explained the systematic prioritization of speed over safety, the culture that had nearly led to catastrophe, and most importantly, the man who'd saved them all. Marcus Reed prevented a disaster through ingenuity, courage, and knowledge that our organization had systematically undervalued, she stated. He did as a janitor what he tried to do as an engineer, protect lives when systems failed. The stock price plummeted. Investors fled. The IPO was postponed indefinitely. But something unexpected happened in the days that followed. Engineers who'd left Hammond Technologies began returning, drawn by the promise of a company that finally valued safety over stock prices. New investors emerged, ones interested in sustainable growth rather than explosive returns. The media, initially skeptical, began telling the story of corporate redemption, of a company that had chosen truth over profit. A month later, Catherine uncovered the final piece of the puzzle. Hidden in archived emails, she found the trail of the third-party firm that had modified the original designs. They'd done it with full knowledge of the risks, calculating that the probability of failure was acceptable against the certainty of reduced costs. The same firm had provided consultation for the recent modifications, their fingerprints on every decision that had nearly led to disaster. They optimized for profit. Catherine explained to Victoria and Marcus in a quiet meeting room. Every change, every cut, every modification was designed to maximize return while staying just barely within legal safety requirements. She showed them charts, projections, cold calculations that had treated human lives as acceptable variables in profit equations. Marcus studied the documents with the detached focus of someone examining evidence of a crime he'd always suspected but never proven. They're still operating, he observed, his voice carefully neutral. Still consulting for energy companies, still making the same recommendations. His fingers traced the modifications that had killed his wife, the same patterns repeated in presentations dated just months ago. Not anymore, Victoria said. Her decision immediate and absolute. We're going public with all of it. Every document, every email, every decision that prioritized profit over lives. She looked at Marcus, seeing in him not a janitor or even an engineer, but a partner in transformation. Will you help me design something better? The Reed-Hammond Safety Protocol became the industry gold standard within a year. It wasn't just a technical solution, it was a philosophy that embedded safety into every level of operation. Redundant pressure sensors that couldn't be overridden by management, bypass systems that operated independently of main power, manual overrides that actually worked under pressure, and most importantly, a culture that valued the insights of every employee from CEO to janitor. Marcus officially rejoined Hammond Technologies as Chief Safety Architect, a position created specifically to ensure that no warning sign, no matter how small, would be ignored. His office, he'd insisted on a modest one, became a pilgrimage site for engineers seeking to understand how systems really failed, not just how they were supposed to work. His notebook, once hidden in shame, became required reading for every new employee. Jessica was promoted to Vice President of Safety Operations, finally given the authority to match her responsibility. Her first act was to institute the Stop Work Authority. Any employee, regardless of position, could halt operations if they identified a safety concern. It was used 17 times in the first month, preventing 3 significant incidents and identifying dozens of minor issues that would have compounded into major problems. Ryan reformed security protocols to prioritize human judgment over rigid rules. His teams were retrained to recognize that sometimes breaking protocol was the most secure option, that human intuition could identify threats that procedures might miss. The security department became partners in safety rather than enforcers of access, their knowledge of the facility's every corner becoming an asset rather than just surveillance. Stephen underwent his own transformation, evolving from a practical manager, focused on deliverables, to a leader who understood that the fastest path wasn't always the right one. He instituted safety sprints, dedicated time for teams to identify and address potential issues without pressure to maintain production schedules. The innovation that emerged from these sessions proved that safety and progress weren't opposing forces, but complementary ones. 6 months after the near disaster, Hammond Technologies unveiled the redesigned Phoenix Core. It produced clean energy at 97% efficiency, exceeding every projection. But the real achievement wasn't in the numbers. It was in the 43 safety innovations that had been integrated without compromising performance. Proof that doing things right didn't mean doing them slowly. The demonstration for investors was different this time. Instead of pushing the system to its limits, Victoria and Marcus showed what happened when things went wrong. They deliberately triggered failure modes, demonstrating how the Reed-Hammond Protocol prevented each from becoming catastrophic. Investors watched a system that could fail safely, recover gracefully, and protect human lives absolutely. This isn't just about energy, Victoria told the assembled crowd. It's about proving that technology can be both revolutionary and responsible. That innovation doesn't require sacrificing safety. That profit doesn't have to come at the cost of principles. Beside her, Marcus nodded, his presence a testament to the truth of her words. The installation ceremony was held on a crisp autumn morning, the first Phoenix Core providing power to a low-income neighborhood that had suffered from rolling blackouts for years. A bronze plaque beside the main entrance read, ****, Reed-Hammond Protocol, ****, in memory of those lost to preventable failures, ****, in honor of those who prevent them, ****, beneath it, smaller text. Safety is not the absence of risk, but the presence of those willing to see it. Emma Reed stood with her father, her robot tucked under one arm, watching as the facility hummed to life. She'd added modifications to her robot, redundant power systems, emergency stops, tiny safety protocols that mirrored her father's work. "It's like Mom's watching," she said quietly, feeling the warmth of the sun through the facility's solar collectors. Victoria placed a small box in Marcus's hands. Inside were 2 golden pins, honorary engineer badges, that hadn't been awarded in a decade. "One for you," she said, "and one for Emma when she's ready. Though something tells me she already is." The girl beamed, her robot's LED eyes blinking in what could only be described as approval. The final image was captured by a photographer, but felt by everyone present. Sunlight streaming through the industrial architecture, refracting through cooling tubes and observation windows, transforming the harsh reds of warning lights into the warm gold of promise. The debt between 2 families, 2 generations, 2 approaches to the same dream, had finally been paid, not in settlements or silence, but in truth and transformation. Marcus Reed had entered Hammond Technologies as a janitor seeking redemption. He stood now as a guardian of progress, proof that the most important work often happened when no one was watching, that the greatest innovation sometimes came from those trained to see what others overlooked. The man who'd been ordered to stay out of the lab had instead stayed close enough to save it, and in doing so, had saved something much more valuable than a company or a reactor. He'd saved the belief that technology could serve humanity without sacrificing it, that ambition could coexist with conscience, that the distance between a CEO and a janitor was smaller than the space between ignorance and wisdom. The Reed-Hammond Protocol would go on to prevent dozens of disasters across the industry, each prevention a quiet victory for two men who'd tried to build something better and the families who'd finally succeeded. As the crowd dispersed and the facility settled into its operational rhythm, Marcus opened his notebook to a fresh page. There was always more to observe, more to improve, more to protect. But now he wrote in the open, his insights valued rather than hidden. His vigilance recognized as the gift it had always been. The janitor who'd saved the CEO had become something more, a reminder that heroes wore many uniforms, that wisdom came from unexpected sources, and that sometimes the best person to prevent a disaster was the one who'd already survived one. The Phoenix core purred with stable energy, its light no longer threatening but promising a beacon of what was possible, when profit bowed to principle, when speed yielded to safety, when the voices from the margins were finally heard in the boardroom. It was David Hammond's dream, refined by tragedy, protected by sacrifice, and finally realized through the partnership of two unlikely allies who discovered that the greatest power wasn't in the reactor at all. It was in the courage to tell the truth, the wisdom to listen to warnings regardless of their source, and the strength to choose right over easy, even when the cost seemed too high to bear. The explosion that had been prevented would never make headlines. The disaster that didn't happen would never trend. But in the quiet corners of Hammond Technologies, where janitors still pushed their carts and engineers still ran their tests, everyone knew the truth. Safety wasn't a protocol, or a system, or a department. Safety was a promise kept by people who understood that every gauge checked, every valve tested, every warning heeded was an act of love for strangers who would never know their names. And in that promise, in that vigilance, in that care, lay the true power of human innovation, not in how fast we could move or how much we could profit, but in how carefully we could carry the future without dropping it.